Good afternoon and welcome to Volunteering Victoria's webinar series. I'm Sarah Sterling, our Sector Development Manager, and I'm pleased to be bringing you these webinars on a monthly basis of volunteer managers talking about their experience related to themes of volunteer managers. Before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land which we call Australia. Though we are likely logging on from different parts of Australia, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and future from traditional custodians across the country. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests. In the interests of all other listeners, please keep yourself on mute during the webinar. You should have arrived on mute, but if you want to check, you can check down the bottom of the screen by hovering over the mute button. Feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourselves. But if you have a question, we'd ask that you submit it through the Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. We'd appreciate you bearing with us through any technical glitches, given we have someone logging on from off-site today. And we will upload this webinar once it's available to stream for you to download and listen to in the next few days. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guests, Sam and Rebecca. So Sam joined YACVIC in May 2017 after working at a number of community organisations, including as a learning and development coordinator and a volunteer coordinator and a vocational support worker, running workshops for long-term unemployed young people and adults with mental health needs. Sam's role at YACVIC is to support the engagement of young people in the work that they do and the voice that we have, as well as supporting the youth sector through training and on youth participation and the Code of Ethical Practice. Sam also runs the Youth Participation Practice Network, YPPN, a community of practice for workers across Victoria supporting young people in youth participation, engagement and empowerment roles. So Beck has been at the RSPCA in the Volunteer Engagement Program for coming up to 3 years. She's held previous roles in the child and family services and disability sectors, and she's worked with volunteers in previous roles, and this inspired her to become more involved in the volunteering sector about 6 years ago, and she hasn't looked back. So welcome, Sam and Rebecca.
Hey, how you going?
Now, we do have a slightly unusual setup this time. So I'd just like to check that everyone can hear both of our panelists, Sam and Rebecca, because we do have someone logging on from home. Is anyone having any audio problems? Can hear everyone. Wonderful. We are good to go. So thank you all for logging on and appreciate that. And we'll start with a really easy question to the panelists, and I'll talk to Sam first. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your organisation?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Sam. I work at the Youth Affairs Council Victoria, YACVIC. As Sarah has already said, we're the peak body for young people and the sector that supports them. So our role is around advocacy, resourcing, training and development. Sarah's already given me quite a nice intro, so I won't repeat all of that. But my role, it's important to note my role isn't specific as a volunteer manager, but the young people that we engage in our initiatives are often giving their time for free, and so much of my role does involve volunteer management, and I've worked in volunteer support and coordinator roles previously, and it's great to be here. I hope you can all hear me.
Great. So thanks, and special thanks because Sam is logging on from offsite. So please do continue to tell us if you can't hear any, if you encounter any audio issues. So Beck, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organisation.
So I'm with RSPCA Victoria in Burwood. I guess our vision is around ending cruelty to all animals and doing that in partnership with our community. So my role is providing oversight and support to our team of volunteers across the state. We have volunteers in pretty much all areas of our operations, from our animal care centres through to our op shops, and we have great volunteers who come out and support our events like Million Paws Walk and our upcoming Cupcake Day. Hard to say.
Very hard to say. Awesome. So as with all of these webinars, I really like to talk a little bit about an origin story, because sometimes it's we all seem to come to volunteer management from a different sector and different experience. So Sam, are you able to tell us about your first role as a manager of volunteers, or your first involvement with volunteerism?
Yeah, of course. So I started volunteering as a young person. It was mainly through interest in sports that took me to volunteering, and pretty casually as well. But when I started at university, I was studying drama at university in the UK, where I'm from, and I got involved in a number of student-led community projects. And then when I graduated, an internship was created at the Student Union to support those student projects to run. And it seemed like a really great way to sort of basically continue doing what I loved. And so I jumped at the chance and was lucky enough to get the position. So it was a great opportunity to continue those relationships and build skills around people management and facilitation, which is what I've always loved about volunteering and the sector as well.
Wonderful. And how about you, Rebecca? How did you get started?
I think my path to volunteering was a bit like most people's who work in this area. You sort of fall into it. I had a couple of roles working with volunteer caregivers in the foster care area, and that really sparked my interest in volunteering, and that sort of continued throughout a couple of roles after that area. So working with volunteers who were working with our clients, and that really led to me wanting to do more in this area and really recognise the contribution that volunteers make to our community. And that's sort of how I ended up where I am today.
Wonderful. I do always think it is really interesting, because there is such a diversity of experience and pathways in our sector. So for those of you listening, this webinar is going to be slightly different in that we're talking a bit more from a macro policy context, and then Rebecca's going to talk a bit more about how she's implemented policy at RSPCA. So not all of the questions are going to go to both of our panel members today. And we did originally have a young person lined up, Angelica, to speak to her experience at organisations, but unfortunately she's been unable to join us today. But we'll see if we can get her contribution at a later date. So first context to Sam, really addressing, I guess, what's the policy context of involving young volunteers, and what are the barriers for young people in getting involved with volunteering, and also for organisations?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I guess the first policy key policy to bear in mind when working with under 18s is, of course, the Working with Children's check. And that's all those that are over 18 who are working with young people need to do the check. They're free for volunteers, and there's a fee for employee checks. They've been around for a number of years now, and they're relatively effective. The process is pretty straightforward, and the cards come through within a few weeks. But it does mean that you need to be prepared, and this can obviously be a barrier. You can't just turn up at an event and expect to volunteer when there are children involved. There are also the challenges of interstate volunteering, as each state has their own children's check system. If it's a one-off event and you're traveling interstate, then there's usually a clause that allows you to do the work without a card. But it can be a bit confusing, and it can be a bit off-putting for people. There have been some changes over the years, and the most recent of those was removing the word supervision, so that anyone working with children, regardless of whether they're being supervised, is required to get a check. That only came into play in the last couple of years. And the contact with children has also expanded to include written, oral, and electronic and digital which reflects more of how the volunteering kind of landscape's developing, I guess, and interaction with children and young people is changing as well. And that electronic and digital space is obviously a growing space, and it's also a space that there has been issues with regulation and that kind of thing. So for years, the Working with Children Act, which underpins the Working with Children checks, was the key legislation in relation to working with children, but policy now also covers the Victorian Child Safe Standards, which we'll talk a little bit more about soon. But just, jumping into the barriers for young people, I think it's important to, I guess we haven't defined young people actually. It might be important for some to realise that when we talk about young people, the Victorian government are talking about the age 12 to 25. So the adolescence and young adulthood are obviously times of significant change for young people, going through schooling, potentially moving out, potentially university, maybe moving away from home, getting first jobs. All of those things are times of huge significant change. Long-term commitment could be difficult for some, bearing in mind all of those things I just mentioned. There'll be varying degrees of competing responsibilities, such as school, family, religion, and culture. Those living outside metro areas will often have to rely on others for transport, as well as the extra travel time and costs that are involved. Many young people will need to prioritise paid work. On top of all of this, it can be difficult to tell when an opportunity is going to be meaningful and respectful, and whether an organisation will see the valuable contribution that young people can make. When we think about media and politics and the focus on young people, it's usually highlighting extreme and negative examples that are not representative of the whole. And so most young people today are highly values driven. The research shows that they're eager to connect with vision and mission and to make positive change in their communities. Young people are more connected globally and to global issues than they ever have been before. And the vast majority of young people are not seen for their full potential. Barriers for organisations, I think it's probably cutting through some of that media and political hype, and being brave enough to work with young people to create opportunities that are meaningful for both young people and the organisation and community. If there's not a culture of engaging young people and supporting and respecting young people, this can be a serious challenge for volunteer managers and those looking to support the engagement of young people.
Thanks, Sam. That's, really sets the scene in terms of, I guess, some of the context of involving younger volunteers. Beck, does that line up with your experience at RSPCA based on what you're hearing from, the young people who want to be involved?
Yeah, I think Sam's point around recognising that it's a significant period of change for young people in their life. And I think being able to offer a program that can really support keeping younger volunteers engaged through that process is really important. And I know at RSPCA we really try to focus on being as flexible as we can and recognise that there's lots of changes going on in lives, work, school, schedules changing, and we really try to keep our volunteers engaged and being able to change shifts, days of the week. All of that is something that we find has helped us keep engaged with our younger team. And I think that that flexibility is very important in terms of barriers for the organisation. And I think a lot of people see that as an off-putting thing, but I actually think that if you can work with it, it'll keep your volunteers engaged with you across the lifespan.
Absolutely. You might have a bit of flexibility in the short term, but if that flexibility allows a young person to be engaged throughout several different life stages, then that's a brilliant thing. So again, through to you, Sam, around the policy context, what's changed in the last 5 years to either help or hinder youth involvement in volunteering? In particular, you've mentioned the Child Safe Standards briefly. If you could give a bit of an overview, and what does this mean for organisations?
Yeah, sure. So the Victorian Child Safe Standards is definitely the key change that's happened to the sector over the past few years. And it's not even really just the sector, it actually affects anybody or any organisation or any service that interacts with children and young people. So the scope is absolutely vast. And following the growing pressure from the community about high-profile institutional child abuse, as well as the betrayal of trust inquiry and the resulting report that came out at the end of 2013, the government committed to the 15 recommendations that came out of the report, including the introduction of minimum standards for ensuring child-safe environments and an independent oversight or reportable conduct scheme, as it has become. It first rolled out in schools and then more broadly across all services in 2017. We haven't got time to go into full detail here, obviously, and there's lots of information on the Commission for Children and Young People's website. That's ccyp.vic.gov.au, and they also run regular information sessions. But as a basic intro for those who are new to the Child Safe Standards, there are a series of 7 cultural and procedural standards that every service, organisation and provider in Victoria that works with young people is expected to comply with by law. This relates to all children under the age of 18. Some are super simple policies and procedures that your organisation is likely to already have or have a version of that can be reviewed and adjusted to meet compliance. But some are more aspirational, about creating environments and cultures of child safety through youth participation and inclusion, which may be more daunting to organisations that haven't traditionally worked in this way. And for some organisations, they have never ever thought about how to interact with children or giving them a voice within how they're operating, how they're working. For YACVIC, this is absolutely our space of expertise. We're unashamed of our kind of youth participation nerdiness, I guess. It takes up a lot of my time in a good way. I'm having conversations about this all the time with people working with young people. And so for us, it's exciting to see legislation that embeds the human rights of young people to be involved in decisions that affect them. Overarching the individual 7 standards, there are 3 principles which lay specific focus on the safety of young people who are Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, those who are living with a disability, and those who are from culturally and or linguistically diverse backgrounds. These are the cohorts who research has shown have most often had their safety disregarded, their human victims of abuse. That's not to say that there are not other young people who are also facing significant risks due to their identity, marginalisation or experience of disadvantage. And so, for example, it's important to be aware of the challenges faced by young people in out-of-home care, those who have experienced homelessness, and those who identify as LGBTQI+, as an example. Again, that's not an exhaustive list, they're just examples. Added to this is the rollout of the national child safe principles in the last 12 months, which are guidelines rather than mandatory as they are here in Victoria. They don't differ madly from Victoria's standards, but the Victorian government are in the process of reviewing the Victorian standards and exploring ways to align as closely as possible with the national principles. So I guess it's important to realise that things are likely to change a little bit over the next few years, and it's also important to realise if this isn't something that you're talking about in your organisation, then it is important because it is compulsory, it is a legal requirement, and so you could be audited and could be expected to show how you're meeting the standards.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a significant piece of policy and really important for organisations to be aware of. So turning over to you, Beck, how has this policy context, the Working with Children Act and the Child Safe Standards, how has this affected your youth volunteer involvement at RSPCA? And what, if any, specific processes did you undertake to get to where you are today in terms of youth involvement, particularly in your op shops and shelters?
I guess as an organisation, we have worked to develop our policies and processes to ensure that we've been meeting our legal obligations. We are one of the few RSPCAs in Australia that offer younger people the opportunity to volunteer within our programs. And in Victoria, we felt really strongly that this was something that we wanted to make sure could continue with some of the changes in the legislation. I guess in terms of process, we've got such a varied program base across our organisation that we did a lot of mapping of our volunteer roles and identified against the standards how we were meeting them for those areas. I guess a practical example of this would be some of our volunteer roles were in our school holiday program, which required working with children, but other roles in other areas such as animal care didn't have that as a requirement. So I guess it was a lot of time, but it was well worth it to ensure that we were making sure that our younger volunteers were safe and we were meeting our obligations. We also used it as an opportunity to look at how we were supporting our younger volunteers within our program and how we were supporting our staff to support our younger volunteers and making sure that they had a really good experience while they were with us. I guess in terms of practical things that we've put in place, we developed our own RSPCA Victoria Child Safe Policy and Procedure document. And to ensure that we embedded that into all of our onboarding processes for the organisation, both paid and volunteer, and ensuring that our new team members understood the expectations on them as part of the new standards and how we rolled that out initially to our teams. We also developed some internal information sheets that help to provide support with the organisations. So, for example, we've got a general frequently asked questions document around defining youth volunteering, some of the things that we would consider when placing younger volunteers, and I guess promoting a more mindful approach to our younger team members. We provided a document specifically for our younger teams. So as they joined us, we provided them with information about how we would look after them while they were with us, ensuring that they knew where to go for assistance and support. Given our programs are so varied, that can change from place to place across the organisation. And the third handout that we developed was for our staff, so really giving them a bit of a heads up around working with younger volunteers and some of the slight differences, and really highlighting the role that they had in making sure that their younger teens had a good experience. I guess the other thing that we used a lot was the best practice principles for involving volunteers and making the best matches for our roles. So we often went back to our role profile, and I think that having the skills and knowledge to undertake a role sort of surpasses the concept of age. We've also built into our program an additional point of contact after the commencement in a role for a younger person, whereby our team makes contact individually with the younger volunteer, either by phone or email. Phone doesn't usually work so well. Kids like to be on the email, so that's where we usually get our best responses. And we've also got a practice that we've retained throughout this review process around engaging parents and guardians in that initial onboarding so they know what's happening. So that's it in a very brief nutshell.
Absolutely, but I think it's important to highlight those differences to staff, certainly, and it sounds like you've developed a wide range of resources to try and cover all of your bases, and even be in contact with the parents and guardians. So that's great. So we'll keep you in the hot seat, Beck. I guess I'd like to flesh out why it was really important to you at RSPCA Vic to continue involving young people, I guess, in the risk-adverse environment that we have. Were there particular messages that helped when you were talking to kind of management at RSPCA about continuing to foster youth involvement? It could be very easy for organisations to say, I'm a little scared of the risk. I'm not going to involve younger volunteers, but you guys obviously felt very strongly about it.
Yeah, I think we were really lucky in that we had a lot of support internally for engaging with our younger volunteers. Our approach to implementing the changes around the child safe standards were really around how we could improve on what we were doing and making sure that we were providing the supports we needed to but also taking the opportunity to strengthen what we were doing. I guess we had to balance that with ensuring we weren't putting too many additional barriers in place. And that was a bit of a fine line, but I think we've struck a really good balance. I guess in our work, we also focused on the benefit of engaging younger volunteers from the perspective of the work that RSPCA does, which is around with the community ending cruelty to all animals. And it was just didn't really make sense to exclude a group of volunteers that could contribute so much to that vision. So I guess that we really tried to strengthen that concept of an ongoing relationship across an individual's lifetime, whether that's as a volunteer, fundraising, or I guess raising in the community the issue of animal cruelty and how you can contribute to preventing that.
Yeah, there's absolutely an effective network of advocates out there. And actually, I was at another Volunteering Victoria training yesterday, and we're talking about everybody's first experience volunteering, and about half of their first experiences volunteering were at the RSPCA.
I could tell you a little story about some volunteer training we were doing to some of our staff members. This is by the by. And we had a volunteer picture up in one of our training sessions, and one of the staff members goes, "That's my picture." And we were like, wow. And it was a picture from like 5 or 6 years ago, and she'd become a staff member. And yeah, it was just a really nice story. I did check with, I'm like, we did get consent to use your photo. So yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's awesome. And I guess one final flesh out, I'd like to know how you handled the different environments. You've sort of told me that the biggest areas that you involve younger volunteers is in RSPCA op shops and also in your animal shelters. And I guess, was the process for, I guess, defining volunteer involvement different in these particular different environments, and what was, I guess, different about them?
I guess the environments are different, but the guiding principles remained the same. So it really came down to that exercise around mapping and looking at what the obligations were for each role. But in the end, we decided to actually strengthen the requirements for our program in the areas of op shops. And as a result of this work, we actually introduced a mandatory working with children check as one of our internal requirements for volunteers. And we rolled that out to all existing volunteers in our op shop network and all new coming volunteers. And I've got to say that that change was really supported by all of our teams, whether they were paid or volunteer, and it was something that the organisation really embraced. And it's a great opportunity for younger volunteers who want to get experience and contribute to the work of RSPCA, but maybe not in that direct animal care role. So the op shops are a great opportunity to get out there and gain some practical skills while still contributing to our overall reason for being.
Great. And so, Sam, YACVIC really does kind of, I guess, practice what it preaches in terms of engaging youth volunteers and engaging young people in the work that you guys do. Can you talk to us a little bit about how, you know, YACVIC involves younger volunteers? And do you think that being, I guess, a younger organisation on the whole helps you attract young people to be involved?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you need to, it's the age-old truth that you need to be able to see people like you in the organisation, in the images that are used, you know, at the training, at the induction, that kind of thing, so that people feel comfortable. They feel like they're in a place that sees them, that will understand them and respect them. And so I think that does help. We do put a big emphasis on employing young people in the organisation, and we put young people at the front of everything that we do as best we can. Realistically, that's not always 100% possible, but where we can, we'll use our young members and our reach across the sector and across Victoria to make sure young people's stories, young people's opinions are front centre of what we do. And then, so we we talk about youth participation and youth engagement more than youth volunteering. We don't necessarily split up our thinking around what goes into that. So when I talk about best practice, I'm sort of talking about youth participation, which is a little bit different from just standard volunteering. Not completely different, and there's definitely massive overlap. Because, as I say, a lot of our roles are voluntary. But what we do is we approach everything with three principles, and that's thinking about empowerment, so empowerment of young people and making sure that they're being given the information that they need to make decisions that are informed. We talk about inclusiveness and thinking about trying to make everything that we do as inclusive as it can be. That isn't necessarily something that you can tick off a list and say that you're absolutely doing it. It's definitely something that we're always striving towards, but thinking about some of those groups that I mentioned earlier and thinking about how we can make sure that our opportunities are accessible for them. They find out about them in the first place, but they're then supported and able to take part in the opportunities. And then the third one is around meaningful involvement. And so that's particularly thinking about making sure that when we're engaging young people in what we're doing, we're not just using them. We're thinking beyond tokenistic young people being seen and not heard, and moving into that ground of young people being seen, heard, listened to, and acted upon. And so the opportunities that we offer are varied. Exactly like I said, I think flexibility is one of the absolute keys to working successfully with young people. It's remembering that one rule for one young person isn't going to be the same for all young people. Thinking about those different stages, life commitments, means that different young people are going to want different things from a volunteer opportunity. All our kind of participation approach a few years ago, and we broke advisory group, a reference group, which everyone's there on a voluntary basis to feed into the work that YACVIC are doing. We actually broke that apart and thought about what are the specific roles that young people can do, so that we could create varied opportunities with varying degrees of commitment. So those young people that just wanted to give up a day could volunteer at an event. Those that wanted to specifically get involved in policy can look at our Young Thinkers in Residence program. Those that are particularly interested in employment or are looking for work or want to feed into our recruitment, we train up young people to sit on our interview panel, so that every staff member that we recruit at YACVIC has interacted with a young person connected to YACVIC, and that young person has had an opportunity to give us feedback in with the culture at YACVIC. We have young people on our board of governance as well. We offer opportunities for young people to write for our blog. We create partnerships with other organisations and support them with their engagement, so that we can support, we can undertake their sort of participation for them and support young people in a way that they may not have capacity to do. I think that's it. And the role description bit, I can't remember if I mentioned that, but I picked up on that from what Rebecca was saying, and I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's really important to go out to young people with a clear description, or and it doesn't have to be necessarily words. It could be a video, it could be a cartoon, could be something that just describes what the role is, so that everyone's on the same page about what to expect. And the last point was thinking sort of more broadly than just adapting opportunities that are successful for older people into opportunities for young people, but actually thinking about how things could be done differently, giving young people the opportunity to feed into those ideas and feed into that creativity, and to create some of those opportunities that will speak on a level with young people in a much more successful way than older people can, dare I say it.
Absolutely. I think it's a really key point to highlight. So often, I think in many organisations, and we certainly get asked this as the volunteering peak body from time to time, how do we get young volunteers? What is this mythical young volunteer? And had Angelica been here, she was going to talk a little bit about the difference being in a youth-led organisation and, you know, an organisation that didn't kind of, I guess, bring in that voice of youth. And, you know, if you have younger volunteers at your organisation and you're hoping to increase the number of younger volunteers, first step, you know, that I would say is really important is to go back and talk to them and say, what is it about this opportunity that works for you? And are there, you know, sort of problems or challenges with this opportunity, barriers for you getting involved? And do you have any advice on how, you know, the organisation could engage you, you know, more effectively?
Yeah, I'd definitely jump in there and say that I'd agree with all of that, 100%. And just to remember that young people are very willing to give feedback as well. You have to be very open to that and kind of step into a little bit, because sometimes it can be confronting to be told things that you're not doing well. But I mean, I would urge people to step into that and take it as an opportunity to listen and to learn and to do things better. And I think, as Rebecca said earlier, if you can engage with young people, and you mentioned it as well, Sarah, that when you engage well with young people, you have volunteers for life and you have advocates for life and people that are a part of your mission. So there's a real calling there, and it's quite an untapped kind of, you know, calling, I guess, to get young people involved and to make them partners and part of your organisation for a long time.
Great. So we are going to finish up fairly shortly, just because we do. We did hope to have Angelica with us, so unfortunately we are a little bit shorter in terms of timing for the webinar. So if you have any questions, please type them into either the chat box or the Q&A box, questions specifically for Sam and Rebecca. Otherwise, I'll finish up with, I guess, a final question to both Sam and Rebecca, which is that what advice would you give to both organisations looking to involve younger volunteers and to younger volunteers who want to support causes that they're passionate about? So I'll throw to you, Rebecca, first. And in the meantime, please type any questions that you'd like into the box. And, you know, thank you for your participation today.
Thanks, Sarah. I guess for us, we really couldn't do what we do at RSPCA Victoria without the support of our volunteers, and they're so important to us. So I guess my advice as an organisation is to really keep it simple to plan for your success. Having younger volunteers on your team can be incredibly beneficial for everyone involved. Making sure that you're aware of what your obligations as an organisation are to younger volunteers, applying the best practice principles to volunteering, and trying to reduce barriers wherever you can. I think those would be my key points for organisations. But I also would add to that, and I think both Zara and Sam have touched on it, is really looking at how you're engaging with volunteers, particularly younger volunteers. So technology is really useful. We often get a better response from using non-traditional methods. So things like Facebook, we're using Better Impact. So we're getting a lot of different ways of communicating with our younger volunteers. And Sam, I think you talked a little bit about offering opportunities for younger volunteers at times that they are free. So we're really lucky that we do have the ability to offer some roles on weekends for our younger volunteers, and we get a lot of people coming in with family members and volunteering on shift. So that's a great way to stay in touch with the organisation. I guess for younger volunteers, my advice would be to reach out to the causes that you find meaningful and ask how you can become involved. That could be the start of something new and different at the organisation, which could really harness some of your passion to your cause. And if you can't volunteer because of age being a barrier, then maybe, you know, talking about what are the other ways that you can become involved to support the work. Yeah.
Great. Sam, and do you want to answer that question, and then we'll go to the next, the questions which have come in, which is great. There are quite a few of them, so that's really exciting. Thanks for asking. Sam, do you want to just wrap up with final advice to organisations and young people?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, for organisations, I think I'd say be brave and try things. Yakvik are always trying out new ideas and speaking with the young people involved and learning from the results of what comes. Sometimes we make mistakes, and we go again. We try and change things, we iterate, and we kind of take that approach of learning. I personally think it's really important to not see things in a black and white frame of success and failure, but thinking about how we can do better and how we can do better. We gave youth participation a massive overhaul, as I said 3 years ago, and we're still in that period of trial and error now. I personally don't think you ever find a single approach that will work forever. Times change, young people change, organisations change. It's important to be flexible and to be willing to try those new things. I'm a big believer in learning from others and looking into what other organisations are doing. Connect with the ones that you think are doing well and ask them how they did it, and try some of the ideas out in your environment. My experience has been that most people are excited to talk about their work, they're proud of their successes, and they're willing to share their learnings, not failings, learnings, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself. But most of all, I'd suggest to speak with young people. Speak with any young people already part of your volunteer programs and get some quality feedback about what they enjoy and what they think could be improved. You could even go a step further and encourage them to lead this process. Maybe there's a volunteer opportunity or project in there for young people to lead, collecting the data and chatting with other young people to work alongside you to make suggestions for new initiatives and innovations. Yakvik are happy to support you, young people, if something that you feel is daunting or confronting for any reason, then get in touch and we can give you some advice. And we also offer training and services to build your capacity in youth engagement. For example, we can help to design and deliver consultations with young people to inform your child safe compliance or your volunteer programs. You can also get word out through our newsletters and through our social media. If you tag us in and ask for a retweet, we'll be happy to do that and send it out through our newsletter. If you're looking to recruit young people, we're always looking for news and opportunities for young people connected to Yakvik to get involved in. So do let us know and feel free to reach out to me directly. For young people, I'd say that I've always found that I could approach volunteering in one of two ways. One was basing it on my interests and just doing something because it makes me happy. This can be a really important part of my self-care, and I've found it's a great way to explore passions and interests that are different from those in my friends and family circles. And the second one was basing it on my career and future career and thinking about volunteer opportunities that build skills and networks. I'd encourage all young people to be aware of child safety and make sure the places you're volunteering are taking safety seriously. Ask during recruitment processes, check information on websites and any induction or role description information. If you're not fully confident that the organisation actively promotes child safety or you're at all concerned the environment won't support and encourage young people, then just walk away from it and don't be afraid to tell people as well. I'll also give Yakvik a little plug here for young people and encourage you to follow our social media and sign up for our newsletters. We highlight those events and opportunities for young people and for those working with young people, actually. We offer membership, which has exclusive access to the opportunities that I've talked about already, as well as others with partners and networks. And we have those memberships for organisations as well. So if anyone's here on the webinar thinking, I'd like to know a bit more about Yakvik, feel free to get in touch with me, have a look on the website, and I can talk you through what membership is and how we might be able to support you with the work that you're doing.
Great. So we have a number of questions. So what I'll do is just read these out to make sure everyone has an idea of what the question is, and then throw to Sam and Rebecca to respond. So the first one is around what age range do both of your services, so Yakvik and RSPCA, engage with, and how does the legislation have an impact, particularly for young people under 16? So I'll throw to you, Rebecca, first. And
Yep. Our organisation has volunteers from age 15 years upwards. So we often get 14-year-olds, 14 and 9 months, 14 and 11 months trying to apply. But that's sort of our strict cutoff in terms of the younger end. And we have volunteers through to 80s and 90s. I'm happy to say. And I guess the legislation impacting on people under 16, I think Sam covered a lot of that earlier. I'm not sure when the question came through, but just looking at the child safe standards, the national child safe principles that were coming in, they were sort of the legislation, pieces of legislation that really kicked off for us this process of reviewing what we had in place, and then really mapping to make sure that we were onto that side of things as much as we needed to be.
Sam, did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, we work with 12 to 25 predominantly, but increasingly we're talking about raising that age of 25 and how arbitrary that number is, how the change of society means that people who are in their late 20s are really now experiencing similar situations to those who were under 25 a few years ago, thinking about the aging, the rising age of moving out, the inaffordability of renting, let alone buying a house, starting a family, starting your first meaningful employment. All of those things are rising and rising and rising. And so increasingly, I'm trying to find ways to keep our opportunities open for those over 25. In terms of legislation, yeah, the stuff we talked about with child safe standards, with working with children's checks are the key issues to bear in mind, but also parental consent is important for under 16s. And I guess one of the things I didn't mention earlier was a tip around just building those relationships with families, with parents, and potentially with schools. If you don't feel like you've got the infrastructure to support those who are younger, potentially there's a way to do it through partnerships, working with other organisations or working with schools that create those opportunities for children and young people to get involved in a way that maybe you haven't been able to previously, or helps to build that capacity for you.
No, that's great, and a really good point about partnerships. So we'll go to the next question. Is there a great document or manual out there that you think captures best practice aside from YACVIC's website, or are you going to take us to YACVIC's website, Sam?
Yeah, of course I'll take you to YACVIC's website. Our website's yacvic.org.au. We actually do have a best practice youth participation website. It's called YERP, Y-E-R-P, yerp.org.au. And that's all about making change in community. It's written for young people and for those working with young people. So it's kind of like a bit like an online mentor, and you sort of follow through articles that talk you through the process of supporting young people or starting up a project if you are a young person. It isn't specific to volunteering, and I know that Volunteer Victoria are creating a fact sheet to support and resource that specific question. I don't know, Sarah, if you know any timelines on that.
Yes, so that is coming soon. Look out for it on our website. It is currently being made nice and pretty, and Sam has contributed to that, as has Beck, so it's great to have their expertise on this webinar.
I think just in terms of manuals and documents, for me, when we were looking at some of this early work, the Department of Justice's Working with Children Check website has a lot of information on it, and they are also very helpful on the phone. I think I was on first name basis with a couple of people there while we were developing our policies and processes, so I would encourage you to reach out to them if there's anything that you're not sure about as well.
So another specific question, just what were your policies specifically around police checks and working with children's checks for under 18s, for working with under 18s, when it comes to them volunteering? Like, do you require all staff who are involved with volunteers to have both a police check and a working with children's check?
At RSPCA, it's really role by role, so that's where that mapping exercise is really important to us. role requirements vary between them. Some of them are legislation based, some of them are what we've put in place internally. So it's really case by case, role by role, would be the really not helpful answer to that. Sorry.
Sam, did you want to add anything to that?
So because we're a youth organisation, we have a blanket rule that anybody in the organisation volunteering or working or contracted has to have a working with children check. And we do police checks as well for staff. I think it's fine to go on a role-by-role basis. If there's somebody who's just, for whatever reason, is never ever going to have any contact with children, I think that's totally fine. But it is just worth thinking through how information is stored and how information is shared and how projects are managed. And in my mind, it probably towards having everybody with a working children check. It also just means you're ready to go. There's no barrier there for people to get involved in projects or events, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point in terms of being ready to go. And thanks, guys, for hanging in there. We've got 2 more questions. But just wanted to say there was a question specific to whether you have any advice in surveying young people in terms of finding out the opportunities that they might be interested in. You know, the person who's asking had a pretty low person response rate. So it actually appears, unfortunately, and thank you all for hanging in there. Sam has dropped out, and he was dialing in from offsite and a little unwell. So thank you for hanging in there with his sound. We might just kind of cut it off from there. In terms of the last question around whether there is one spot that youth can go to find you specific volunteering opportunities. At this stage, there is not. There are ways to filter the current volunteer search websites, but it's actually a project that Volunteering Victoria is hoping to undertake and survey some of our membership to find out who engages and involves younger volunteers really well, and so to have a list ready to go in terms of young people who contact us wanting opportunities. And then finally, the last question is whether Volunteering Victoria run youth-specific volunteer training for volunteers, not organisations, and the answer is not yet. So I will take that on notice. We might wrap things up there and really appreciate you guys hanging in there with us and perhaps some not ideal audio at times. And thank you for listening. We'll send around the recording and make it available on Volunteering Victoria's website very soon. Thank you all, and we'll hopefully have you log in again next time. And thanks hugely to Sam and Rebecca for their contributions today.
Thanks, everyone.